Good morning. My name is Helen Connolly. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the Commissioner for Children and Young People in South Australia, and it's my honour and responsibility today to guide you through a very important conversation about how can we ensure children and young people with disability receive a fair go. I'd like to start by acknowledging the country I'm on, which is the country of the Kaurna people, traditional custodians of the Adelaide region. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and future. I would like to acknowledge all the elders past, present and future from all the lands that you may be watching on from today, and welcome any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who are logged on to this webinar. And it's also really important to acknowledge the children, because that's what this week is about, and that's where the culture will live on. If you're not familiar with the go-to webinars, I'm just going to give you a little bit of a housekeeping session before we get into the bulk of the morning. So there's a control panel on the right-hand side, which I'm sure you've seen. You are muted and no cameras will be on, and that's being controlled by the NAPCAN office. But if you run into any technical issues, please email them directly, ring and get yourself back on. We're hoping there'll be no technical glitches today. There is a chat function, so we're asking you to put your questions there. We've got a few hundred people online with us from all over Australia, so we are hoping that obviously we're not going to get to everyone's questions, but if they start coming in early, we'll be able to kind of look at them and ensure that where there are themes, that those get addressed. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted onto the website in due course. And any handouts or links or those kind of functions will also be posted in the chat function. There is live captioning available of the webinar today. There is a link in the chat box already. If you require that captioning, please link through there and it will take you to another site where you'll be able to have screen and captioning at the same time. So for those of you who are looking at me thinking, where is this woman? I just want to apologise for my background. People have said it does look like I'm in something not quite like an office. I have to say that I am in a room that's not part of where I would normally be. And so if it looks like a very austere kind of setting, I can assure you it is. So I'm going to do my best to keep it warm and friendly despite the appearances of the place that I'm in. So today we're here as part of this year's National Child Protection Week campaign. The theme of this week this year is to treat all of Australia's children fairly. And to do that, we need to make sure every family and community has what kids need to thrive and be healthy. That story, that statement, that campaign comes essentially from the Core Story for Early Childhood Development project that the Telethon Kids, Minderoo Foundation and Frameworks Institute did in partnership. I think it resonates strongly as we are still, as we know, living in the shadow of COVID-19 pandemic. And my thoughts are with all of you across the country who are still experiencing lockdown. We know that the impacts of this lockdown will be seen for years to come. I think we have not yet worked out specifically what those impacts will be, but we do know that part of the strategy and solution moving forward will be about supporting our children and young people and families in any way that we can. If we are to centre children's wellbeing and safety in our re-emergence from the pandemic challenges, it's a great way to start by thinking about how do we include all, and particularly those children with disability. I just want to say before we get into anything further that as always, some of the topics and content that we might cover in this session may be slightly sensitive and difficult or upsetting for people. So we want you to look out for yourself and remember, no one can see you on this screen. It's okay to step away, to turn off the webinar and come back in as required. Look after yourself while participating. But we've also posted some contact details of services, helplines, etc., that are available for support in the chat box for you as well. That's a bit of a whirlwind of all the things we're going to cover. I thought for me, I am up first in terms of setting a bit of a scene around what some of the work that I've been doing and some of the things that children and young people have told me. So I might get straight into that. As I said, I'm the Commissioner for Children and Young People in South Australia. My role is to regularly engage with children and young people. I do it through focus groups, workshops, surveys, summits, consultations, you name it, and individual conversations as well. I have spoken with thousands of children since starting in this role in 2017, and I would say that despite my best efforts, the voices of children with disability are often the hardest to hear. They are often not chosen by adults to represent their schools or groups or attend the summits and forums that I host. And they're often not members of any of the student represented councils or the youth advisory committees that I also meet with. And although I've met many young people from vulnerable and marginalised groups, including children in care, trans and gender diverse children, young carers, young offenders. And while many of these young people have a disability, it's unusual to meet children and young people who identify as with a disability within those school situations. And I've seen few participatory structures for children and teens. Essentially, this is about saying that from my experience, I think it's pretty fair to say that there just aren't enough opportunities for children with disability to participate in decision-making processes, express their views, or be genuinely listened to. And I struggle to connect with children with disability as citizens. So I think if I'm struggling to do that, it's reasonable to ask how our systems and our decision makers are ensuring that they're listening to children living with disability. We've got the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, we have the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, so we know that we have these conventions which give rise to children's rights, but in spite of this, we see very few everyday opportunities to do so. I guess for those organisations and agencies working with children with disabilities, it's often very difficult, or appears to be difficult, for them to prioritise voice amongst competing demands. So I see from where I sit that often their views are being sidelined or ignored. So there are barriers to participation, as we all know. I'm sure this will come up with the speakers and questions. Barriers that include things like adultism, ableism, the logistics, the kind of lack of opportunity, inaccessible communication methods, lack of skills, training, support and resources. I think these are the things that we all know, but we've known about them for a long time, and I worry that we're not moving fast enough in terms of addressing them adequately. There are some quotes that I've included directly from the voices of children. So in the light of not finding children with disability in other settings, I decided in 2020, 2021 to hold a series of very focused disability conversations with children and young people. Had about 28 sessions, despite COVID, 198 children, but also during that same period, more than 300 young people who completed other work, other surveys I was doing on period, sex and school exclusion, who also identify as living with disability. I guess one of the things, and so these are the next few slides are direct quotes taken from these children. Many of the young people didn't want to be defined by their disability, and what they wanted to do was to participate in discussions on a broad range of topics, not necessarily youth-specific or disability-specific. And like all young people, they wanted to be valued for their age and their relationships and their achievements, and they wanted to be recognised for their identities as a brother, a sister, a friend, a sports person, whatever those identities are. In terms of inclusion, I think there's some of these quotes, a lot of the conversation with children was around SSOs or student support officers, with a varying kind of thing from like finding having an SSO as either being quite restrictive, but for some also quite liberating. But I think there was the number one thing that came through to me was kids saying they don't know why this person is with them. So there's work around that and conversations to be had about the level of information that children and young people are getting about their own situations. Independence was a really strong theme as well, which came up with many young people identifying that they live their lives surrounded by adults, whether they're parents, teachers, SSOs, therapists, paid support, and so that they felt there were very few aspects of their life that weren't kind of influenced by adult views. And the other thing I think was really interesting, that the difference between conversations with adults and children was around the NDIS, and that the fact that the word NDIS rarely came up with any of the children and young people that we did connect to. They were concerned around a whole range of things, around opportunities to express for their futures, post-school pathways, things around being included in all sorts of different places. But mostly they shared their hopes for lives beyond school and what that might offer to them as they as they move into adulthood. So others wanted to develop confidence and skills, to have opportunities to be independent, the support to feel valued, included, and to have social experiences and belonging. I hope that sets a bit of a tone and a theme for the work that I've been doing in this area. I am in the process of writing a report which kind of captures all of these voices, but certainly the themes of inclusion, identity, inclusion and independence were the dominant themes of those conversations with children from primary school through to secondary school and young adults. I'd now like to introduce a young person, Kay Barnard, to the group. Kay is a young queer non-binary autistic person, passionate about the inclusion of young disabled people in issues that affect their communities. Kay is a graduate of Children and Young People with Disability Australia, or CIDA as we know it, and their Young Leaders program. And Kay will share some of their story and what they think needs to change. Thanks, Kay.
Awesome. Thank you, Helen. Hi, I'm Kay. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm calling from Wajak Noongar land in Bulu, Perth, Western Australia. I just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which I'm calling from, and also the lands on which you're all calling in from. As a young disabled person, I'll be talking about my lived experience of disability and the importance of listening to your own voices. So before I start, I just want to provide a content note. So I will be speaking about my diagnosis, which can bring up ideas around ableism, as well as a passing mention of mental health distress. If that sounds like something that you can listen to this morning, that's perfectly fine if you need to step away and then come back in about 15 minutes. So I was born a disabled person, but my relationship with disability didn't start until I was an adult. I grew up for the first part of my life in a small province in Mpumalanga, South Africa, which is predominantly 80% non-English speaking. My parents are young professionals. My mum worked as a bookkeeper and my dad worked as an engineer. So we arrived in Australia just after I turned 2. So I started to develop differently to my siblings when I was around 2. I started repeating short sections of TV ads insistently, the same 3 or 4 words over and over. I stopped speaking for days on end, and I could read and write before my 3rd birthday. When I asked my parents about what I was like when I was little, the only thing that they would say is that I threw constant tantrums over everything. So our home videos are cute snippets of my sister's first steps, my brother playing football in the yard, and me crying. We didn't have a word for it back then. I was just badly behaved. This cycle repeated as I got older. At home, I was inflexible and badly behaved. At school, I was disruptive. I was sent to the corner and I didn't know why. I answered questions that weren't really questions. I talked back. I talked over others, and I corrected other children when they were doing things wrong. The school principal told my parents to take me to the doctor. So I sat on a cold steel table while the doctor asked my parents what was going on. So they told her that I was really quiet but well behaved, and that the doctor said that I would outgrow my timidness as I gained confidence. It wasn't until 11 that I saw a behavioural psychologist, more out of convenience than necessity, as my brother was displaying explosive behaviour, so it was easier just to take us all to the appointment. My brother refused to play the games or do the puzzles if I didn't have to do them too. So we saw a lady for a couple of weeks in a cold room in Claremont. She called my parents into her office while my brother and I sat on the little plastic chairs in the waiting room. So my brother has ADHD and here are some tablets to help him at school. I didn't know I'd been diagnosed with autism as an 11-year-old because my parents never told me. For me, we just stopped going to the doctor, even when she posted letters to our house asking to see me. My parents didn't agree with her because I didn't do the things that my brother did and I wasn't getting into trouble at school. I was withdrawn, quiet and shy, and there was nothing really wrong with that. My parents aren't bad people for not telling me. They thought they were doing the right thing. As people who had been ostracized from society for not understanding the language, not having an accent, not fitting in, they wanted to keep me from the same. They have no concept of autism. They don't understand the internal processes and the feeling. I didn't get my diagnosis until my first psychiatric admission when I was 21. So I didn't get my diagnosis until I was past breaking point. And I'm not alone in that. Non-male people are diagnosed at a third the rate of males, and often diagnosis happens after the age of 40 or happens after intense trauma. So I fall into that later category. 10 years after my parents found out that I had autism, I found out, and I wish that I'd known all along. So by not telling me when I was little meant that my life didn't have any context. When I was a child, I didn't think I was autistic. I thought I was weird and that nobody really liked me. So my parents thought it would be kinder if I didn't know, and that an 11-year-old could never understand that. But what happened with that is it prevented me with coming into my disabled identity when I really needed that context in my life. How can I be so smart and struggle so much with things that other children find so easy? Why is it really easy to read and write and do maths, but even as an adult be unable to tie my shoelaces, tell my left from right, or talk to people? I wonder if my life would have been different if the first doctor had asked me if I felt wrong, if I had felt left behind, or if I felt confused. I wonder if things would have been different if she asked me what was going on. I wonder if she would have done more if she knew that it felt like my brain was on fire all the time. But that's not how it's done. Diagnosis comes from the outside. Even as an adult, I couldn't be diagnosed without a full account of my childhood from one of my parents. When we give the authority to those that spectate on disability, we generate an inauthentic view of what it's like to be disabled. So we allow the repetition and solidification of harmful stereotypes about young disabled people. Others stress the wrong parts of our stories. When parents and doctors and researchers without lived experience are termed the expert of what it's like to be a young disabled person, we're not seen and we can't develop that community or that identity. Outside-in perspectives give a one-dimensional view of disability. Am I autistic because I flap my hands and cry in shopping centres? Or am I autistic because my brain feels bubbly and noisy and movement dissipates that feeling? Who we centre when we talk about young disabled people matters. When my psychiatrist told me that I was autistic, the first thing that she said was sorry. As a society, we have focused on the inconvenience that autism presents to society in a way that a diagnosis is an apology. My diagnosis set me free, it explained my life, and it defined my identity. If we listened to young disabled people, would we still say sorry to a diagnosis? Would we identify disability as a tragedy rather than a continuation of the diverse human experience? As a young person, I experienced that double barrier to participation in society. I'm too disabled for non-disabled spaces, but I'm not disabled in the right way enough to be part of disabled spaces. As a young disabled person, my lived experience and disability are constantly taken out of my hands. We're not consulted in decisions that affect us due to our age. Disabled spaces are predominantly for young children or much older adults. Youth disability advocacy is centred around the parents of disabled children. But listening and existing in disabled youth spaces, I can see a shift in understanding of disability, something that I think older adults are yet to catch up on. It's a shift away from the pathologization of our differences to embracing that diversity. For me, disability is not the way that my brain processes sensory information. It's the way that I have to hide myself away to exist. It's the way I have to learn the social rules. I have to sit on my hands when I get excited. And it's the way that other people say, you don't really look autistic, without an understanding that this appearance is a well-practiced act. My autism is not my disability. My autism is my identity. As a non-disabled person, it's not your right to define our experience. It's your obligation to create space for us to exist. It's a commitment to understanding without your perspectives seeping in. Supporting us doesn't look like talking over the top of us. Supporting us looks like reflecting on where your information about our lives is coming from. Who is the experts that you are relying on, and how can you center us in that process? So supporting us is seeing us as experts in our own lives. It's a movement away from interfering on what you think is best for us to actually listening to us.
Kay, I'm sure if the 500 people online were in a room, you would be deafened by the noise of applause for that incredibly honest, informative, grounded, and a bit of a wake-up call for all of us to think about the person at the centre of any of the kind of supports paper you're receiving. Thank you, that was fabulous. I'm now going to move to Mary Sayers, who's the Chief Executive of CIDA, joining in July 2019. Mary, over her career, has worked across policy, research, advocacy and service delivery, and has been working to progress positive outcomes for children and young people and the broader determinants of social wellbeing in many areas. She has family experience of disability as a parent, and as we know, is a passionate advocate for the rights of children and young people. So over to you, Mary.
Thank you very much, Helen, and huge thanks to you, Kay, for sharing your story as well. My name's Mary. My pronouns are she, her, and as Helen said, I'm CEO of Children and Young People with Disability Australia. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which I'm coming to you from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to acknowledge elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this was and always will be Aboriginal land and sovereignty was never ceded. So Children and Young People with Disability Australia is the national representative organisation for children and young people with disability. And we have over 5,000 members who are mainly made up of young people with disability and family members of younger children with disability. And so, as Kay said, we've been doing a whole lot of work to make sure young people's voices are really centred in everything we do. Last year, we had a National Youth Disability Summit, and we had over 250 young people with disability who joined us and who actually co-designed the summit. And there was 4 of those 5 days that were youth autonomous or youth only days, where all the people involved were young people with disability, all the speakers involved were young people with disability. And it was an absolute privilege to host that first ever National Youth Disability program. And we also had, as Kay, a graduate of our Young Leaders program, and we've just embarked on our second Young Leaders program. And we've recently formed a youth council where we've got 12 young people with disability who are members of that youth council who are guiding us in our youth participation, involvement, empowerment work. And so it's really great to hear the voice of Kay speaking today. And just a content note about some of the things I wanted to talk about. I will be speaking about ableism. I'll be speaking about discrimination. I'll be speaking about violence and abuse. And feel free, if this content is difficult to you, for the next 5 to 10 minutes to switch off while I'm speaking. So my own personal experience is as a parent with a now a young man who's just turned 30. He has autism as well, and he was first diagnosed at 11. And it was interesting listening to Kay's story because very much it reflected our experiences as parents, trying to seek out and understand what was happening for Luke. And his diagnosis was one of the most empowering things that could happen for him and for us as parents. It finally gave us and unlocked a key to help us to support him much better. And we let him know straight away as soon as we had a diagnosis. And his disability identity as a young person has been one of the biggest strengths for him. He is proud to be an autistic man. He didn't want to join, he doesn't want to be on the NDIS because he doesn't want to be labelled and put into a category. And he's at 30, moved out of home with his girlfriend and has just secured his first full-time job and is off the disability support pension, which is a huge amount of pride for him. So some of my experience comes into my own personal experience, but also what we're learning from young people, and how do we create those inclusive environments for communities where children and young people can, with disability, can be safe and thrive. And I think the most important thing is that children and young people with disability are children and young people first. They have the same aspirations as all children and young people. These early experiences are critical, and young people with disability that we work speak of their early childhood experiences and the memories of fun they had with their friends and families. And their wellbeing of Australia's children is based on all children having their needs met. Needs that span services and support for health, learning, housing, feeling loved and safe, and feeling good about who they are. However, there is evidence that for young children with disability, there is an absolute over-reliance on early intervention and actually putting, as Kay so eloquently said, problematizing children with disability. And so often they're segregated from their non-disabled peers and put in special pathways or special programs, which leads children and families away from the natural environments and the natural childhood environments and to other children their own age. So attitudes tell us about low expectations, ableism, and in the most extreme examples, these attitudes can lead to an acceptance of physical violence that we don't see for non-disabled children. Unfortunately, children in our schools often experience restrictive practices, such as being secluded and locked in rooms, including suspensions, expulsions and exclusion. And this happens at a far greater rate than for their non-disabled peers. So community attitudes are so critical, and I'm so glad there's over 500 people on this webinar, because each and every one of you are a custodian of attitudes and influences of attitudes. And so primary prevention measures that create long-term community attitude change around ableism and promote understanding and respect for all people with disability are crucial. So there's a number of structural barriers that prevent children and young people with disability having their rights upheld. So we have a lack of visibility in policy. And we often say children and young people with disability get missed in policy spaces around children and young people generally, and they also get missed in disability policy. And this often fails to consider the needs of children and young people with disability. And we've seen this so starkly during the COVID pandemic. We've seen the exclusion that's happened in remote learning, for example, where children and young people with disability have had their educational needs neglected during the pandemic, and a whole range of lack of pandemic planning for children and young people with disability. So a recent policy review mapped out and examined the various national, state and territory policies, agreements and frameworks that relate to child safety across Australia. It found that the inclusion of children and young people with disability in general was minimal, and where they are included, they are only represented in terms of their perceived vulnerability, rather than their rights and their strengths. So children and young people with disability span multiple policy portfolios, and the policy silos lead to service silos, which has a real world impact on children and young people with disability not receiving a fair go. And there's an over-reliance on the capacity of parents, caregivers and families to navigate these complex siloed systems to advocate for their children. And what about those children that don't have that level of family support, which includes children who are in our out-of-home care systems, who don't have parents as empowered advocates with the ability to self-advocate for their child. We have education systems that promote segregation from non-disabled peers, despite overwhelming evidence that inclusion is best for their outcomes. So we have this terrible choice that families have to make because mainstream systems are not inclusive, and there's so much work that needs to be done to make sure that children are included. And this overarching lack of visibility of children is also driven by a lack of available data or disaggregated data for children and young people with disability. So to wrap up with, what is something that each and every one of us could do who are on this webinar, who are working with children and families to be aware of in relation to the inclusion and participation of children and young people? Inclusion for young people in our network means that disability needs to be seen as not something less than or something to be sad about. It's something, and the young people we work with talk about identity, disability pride, and how we reframe the narrative around disability to be something that's part of our identity rather than something that we're not proud of. One young participant in one of our programs, he said that inclusion requires that people with disability are always included from the beginning and not of as an afterthought. And listening to children and young people with disability, this was such a major theme that came from our National Youth Disability Summit, and we do have another summit coming up this year. And children and young people have great ideas and they want to share them. So a practical takeaway from this is, how are you in your work listening to the voices and acting on the voices of children and young people with disability? Do you have systems that are accessible? Do you think about accessibility from the start? We will provide a link from what young people said at our first National Youth Disability Summit, what they said about access and inclusion. We wrote up papers from each of our 5 days based on what young people said. We also will share some fact sheets around that were developed by our next speaker, Professor Sally Robinson, for us, for CIDA, especially for children and young people with disability, including what is violence, abuse, and neglect and exploitation of children and young people with disability. How can we keep children and young people with disability safe? And inclusion and voice is an absolute central pillar in which safety is born. What do you do if harm occurs? And how to get involved potentially in a Disability Royal Commission. And many of you may know, or you may not know, that recently there were increased protections built into the Disability Royal Commission in their confidentiality. So if you as a worker or someone working in the field wanted to provide some evidence to the Royal Commission, your information is also protected. And finally, it would be great if you were interested in joining CIDA. CIDA is free membership for children and young people with disability and their families. But also organisations and individuals can join CIDA for a nominal fee, and I know that that membership will be posted in the link as well. So just a final point, we all have a key role in ensuring children and young people with disability are fully included in the community, in our mainstream services, and to have their rights upheld, and that they are considered as children and young people with their own agency and their own ability to speak for themselves and to tell their own needs and what they need. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mary. And thank you for, I guess, giving us a call to action. I think, as you said, more than 500 people online. If we all went back and reviewed our systems and our actions that we're taking to include children and young people with disability to promote access inclusion, it's a good start. Also, as you said, consider the Royal Commission and what more you can feed in there that might be an action out of today. And for me, the really critical one about highlighting the importance of voice as one of the fundamental pillars of child safety. If we're not listening and if they don't trust us to listen, it's pretty difficult to build a system of safety and support. You're all engaged. I can see listening, and the speakers so far have been fantastic. We haven't got very many questions, so don't leave it to the end, because as soon as we finish listening to our next speaker, Professor Sally Robinson, we'll go into a panel discussion. So please get your questions coming through. But I'd like now to introduce Sally Robinson, Professor in Disability and Community Inclusion from Flinders University here in South Australia. So Sally does research with children, young people and adults with disability about what helps them feel safe, well and happy at difficult times in their lives. Most of her work is done in teams that include people with disability as researchers, as well as asking them for their views. She also works with governments and organisations about how to listen for things that matter to disabled people. So I'm really keen now to listen to Sally and then come back with our discussion. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you very much, Helen. Hi, everybody. It's lovely to have an opportunity to talk with you today, and an absolute privilege to follow Kay and Mary and Helen in speaking today. I'm on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I'd like to acknowledge the significance of their relationship to land and acknowledge that land, of course, was never ceded. I'd also like to acknowledge the importance of people with disability in the fight that they have had continually for people to be safe and to be protected from the harms that they experience at much higher rates than people without disability. I think Kay's presentation in particular highlights to us the importance of knowing our place. I'm a person with disability myself, but my disability is acquired, and I didn't have the kind of experience that the young people that we speak to and work with have. So I think it's very important that people who haven't lived it know their place, and they're in the allyship of working with people who have lived experience of abuse and neglect, and what it takes to be safe in spaces where people have a heightened risk of harm. So our research is, as Helen said, with and by young people with disability. And so Kay's call to centre who we talk about when we're talking about young people with disability is something that we bear in mind all the time in the research that we do. Our work is in difficult spaces, so I am going to talk about violence and abuse, but I'll touch on it very lightly because we take a step back in thinking about what it takes for people to be safe. We're really interested in working with young people about what it takes to promote a safe and a flourishing childhood and young adulthood, because part of the policy emphasis that we have as a country and in our states is about abuse and violence and responding to the experience of abuse and violence. And for children and young people particularly, that's way too late. If we can put our attention much more firmly on what it takes to be a safe and well-supported young person, then of course your whole life is different. And so I'd really like to just spend the few minutes that I've got today talking with you about some of the work that we've done for Royal Commissions and in national research that's focused on domestic and family violence and those kinds of really sensitive spaces, and really talk about what is important to children and young people with disability and what they've shared to us, and a couple of implications of what we think is significant for you. As Mary said, we've all got a part to play, and there are really practical things that we can do. So if we could just go to the next slide. This diagram was built from research that we did with young people with disability about what being safe means to them in their lives. And you can see that being safe breaks down into different kinds of things. So for the young people who were involved in this study, they talked about different kinds of safety. And first of all, they talked about being physically safe. And that was the most straightforward thing for lots of people. It was a baseline issue, you know, a fundamental thing that needed to be met. It was the kinds of problems that people had with physical safety were the most well responded to, the things that people could see and respond to easily. But being physically safe to people meant having a safe place, being out of danger, sticking together with people who you knew and trusted, and not being mistreated. When it came to being emotionally safe, people talked about having trusted relationships, feeling comfortable, being known and understood by other people, being respected and being protected. This was the biggest area that people talked about, the most consistent focus that they had, but it was the most fraught, the most tension-filled area too. It caused significant pain for young people, and it was the most poorly responded to area of personal safety in their lives. People talked a lot about insecurity in their relationships, navigating the tensions between paid and unpaid relationships in their lives, and how they formed and maintained peer relationships that had depth and quality. All of those things that are really difficult tensions for lots of young people, but had particular significance for people with disability. When it came to having access needs met, this was really interesting because we tend to sort of make that a really thin discussion, and we think about, is there a ramp? Can you physically get in? Is there interpreting? But people talked a lot about having social and emotional access needs met as well. And by that, they meant when you walk into a space, are you expected? Or do you go into a cafe and all of a sudden people are racing around and moving all of the chairs and making a big fuss of it because like, oh, we didn't expect a disabled person was going to walk in here. And that made people feel very unwelcome in spaces. So if they were expected in there and felt like it was run of the mill, of course you would be here. This is your community. This is part of where you belong. That was the kind of access needs that people were talking about. And then feeling capable was part of feeling safe as well. And young people were more confident than the other support people, the parents and professionals that we spoke to, in their knowledge and their ability to have their safety strategies implemented and met. And I'll talk about safety strategies in a sec. It was important to young people that they could use their safety strategies wherever it was absolutely possible. And where help was needed, that was offered in a complementary way, that people didn't come in and take over how young people were trying to keep themselves safe in the ways that they felt were best. And the success of that influenced how much people felt listened to and how much they felt involved in problem making. It didn't mean that people wanted to do absolutely everything on their own. People knew that there were limits in what they could do, but they wanted people to work in allyship with them, not to take over from them. So if we could just move to the next slide. There were a series of things that children and young people in our studies have said helped them to feel and be safe. These will resonate with you because they are human things. People talked about home as a foundation, and most, if not all, young people and children have emphasised home as a sanctuary, a place that you go to retreat from stress and distress and regenerate your energy. And for most, but not all, people in our studies, home is a safe space with safe people. And I think that's an important distinction, that not all people have that experience. So we don't want to valorize any of these concepts. People, the same with friendship, that friendship is incredibly important. Friends help young people to feel better about themselves, and they also talk about friends as a protective support that stop people from having to go places alone. There's kind of safety in numbers, and also that emotional feeling of what friends give you. But people talk about friendships in quite shallow terms as well, sort of only as the existence of friends rather than this sort of embedded relationships in the patterns of people's lives sometimes, and talked about friends as a major source of tension for some people too. The same with feeling known and valued. People talked about the multiple ways that positive relationships with people were central in their lives, and in order for people to have confidence to talk about problems in their lives, they needed to have trusted go-to people. But building that trust, building that relationship with people was a source of difficulty for lots of people. Same with telling somebody, very, very much, close relationship with that. One of the interesting strategies too was that people avoided contact with strangers. So lots of children and young people talked about stranger danger. We know from other research that sadly, lots of children and young people, especially people who live service-dominated lives, are more at risk from people they know than from people they don't know. But lots of people talked about being very fearful of strangers. And people talked about strategies of keeping their eyes down, avoiding contact, crossing the street to avoid someone that they didn't know. People talked about dressing in nondescript ways to avoid attention, kinds of things that kept them potentially out of view of people who might be out of view of bullying attention. But at the same time, that also highlights the risk to people of predatory attention. So this sort of risk and safety strategy at the same time. People talked about learning from experience, like everybody else does. You learn as you get older, and you get better at doing things by practicing. And if you don't get the chance to practice, you don't get the chance to improve. And people also talked about how important it was to learn and to have the chance to learn and to be exposed to the same kinds of things that other kids are exposed to. Peer education opportunities, formal education opportunities, both of those things. If we can just go to the next slide, there were, of course, lots of things that people said hindered safety. Their own fears and worries, which were about things that were daily risks and problems for them, but also things that were not likely to happen, like somebody breaking into their house and attacking them in their bed at night, like, you know, all children and young people worry about. Feeling out of control because of things to do with their own disability, but also because of things that were out of their control, like the way that services acted in their lives or the way that schools acted in their lives. The impact of abuse that they had already experienced was significant across several of our studies. We spoke with people who were trauma experienced, and that had a major impact on their lives, of course. Peer pressure really affected people. And under-supported transitions were really big for children and young people because they needed preparation time to be ready for moving from one life stage to another. They needed support through the transition, and they needed support afterwards. That really affected people's sense of safety when they weren't adequately supported. And some people in our studies have had very complex family lives, people who were in out-of-home care or who had very difficult family lives. Some of our work is in domestic and family violence. So there is very complex things going on in under-supported families too. So if we can move to the next slide, I just want to talk now about the safety strategies that I mentioned earlier, that there are gaps between the safety strategies that young people already use and what they want. I really want to highlight here that we think sometimes about children and young people with disability as passive, as people who need support with everything. Our research has shown really clearly that people have ideas, they have strategies, they are using them. And sometimes people get blocked from using their own strategies because people think about people with disability as passive and not able to self-determine what they want, what they can do to keep themselves safe. So in our work, people talked about the things that they can do themselves. They work very effectively sometimes to prioritise emotional safety. They work effectively to prevent harm from happening by restricting where they go, increasing their awareness of danger, limiting contact with people who they don't know, and build capability by working on personal resilience, working on developing their own networks, and actively seeking support to implement the strategies that they have developed themselves. People also talked about what other people can do that will help them to implement their own strategies. And here, for the people who are listening to this webinar, are really practical, thoughtful strategies from young people about what they want from other people. Know me better as a person, as somebody with a very full and flourishing identity, not as a disabled person, but as a person with hopes, interests, priorities, all kinds of rounded, big identities, as Kay and Mary talked about earlier. Promote what I can do, not what I can't do. Understand my particular context and what the risks and the opportunities are inside that context and respond to that. Provide structure within environment and systems and workers and support that is going to promote safety, not limit it, and provide learning opportunities that fit inside the particular context that the person has. And then if we can go to the last slide, people also talked, well, we sort of pulled implications from this, from what most of the young people said about what services and communities can do. There are implications from this about what services can do, which is really around taking greater action. We have a very poor history about actually acting when things happen to people. We can do, as Mary said, I think Mary articulated it much better than I could, about what we can do to increase choice and control in young people's lives in the first place. I've already talked about education, training and learning. And we can address service gaps to make sure that people are not falling between so many cracks in systems. The implications for young people and for practice there are that young people need solid foundational relationships with a range of people to support safety. And supporting young people to feel able to take action and have their strategies received and acknowledged helps to build resilience and safety. For that to happen, young people need high quality relational support. And proactive strategies are needed then to act early on concerns and to avoid abuse, to help people to build a strong sense of personal safety. And the education and skill development about safety and about abuse prevention that sits underneath that is really needed for young people and for supporters, so that everybody's on the same page about what people are learning. Then for policy and organisations, as agencies, we really need to proactively address abuse prevention and develop strategies for promoting personal safety, not look at locking the door after harm's happened. And for that, we need expectations about safety in the organisations that young people use to be really explicit for young people, for staff, for managers, for families and for volunteers. So what safety looks and feels and sounds like in this organisation. And that planning is really needed so that we build resilience and strength across the life course. And then at a community level, what sits underneath and around and alongside that is the need to plan for the physical and social and emotional access of young people with disability in their communities, and that building a sense of belonging and activating people's human rights by having public awareness strategies that encourage solidarity of community members to make people welcome, to encourage a sense of belonging for people in their communities, and inviting people to participate in policy processes so that young people are part of determining what that sounds and feels like. And then, of course, reforming the systems which impact heavily on young people so that when things do go wrong, the legal system, the out-of-home care system, the housing, the school systems, pick things up in ways that are more responsive and work together more effectively. As you can probably tell, I've been rattling this off very quickly and I could talk for another hour on this, but I'll pull up there so that we can move to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sally. Again, another really thought-provoking presentation and that really practical experience of what children and young people describe as safety and what we can all do to promote it. We've got questions, which is fantastic. I think the panel are all going to come back up for a discussion, and we've got quite a good length of time to get into some of the really meaty questions that have been posed. I think what I would say is I love it when you share something and you're also really interested in what people are saying. It makes it makes time go fast and more engaging. So I've loved listening to everyone and just really, I think that sense of layering of our understanding. So taking everyone's perspective and creating something that's much deeper and broader, I guess, in terms of what are the conditions and around that we need to put in place to ensure children are safe, but also the different perspectives of what safety is. So there are some questions. The first one, and probably not surprising, is questions around how we should be talking about disability, the language, that kind of thing. So I'm sure you've probably all got a perspective on this. So starting with any one of you, what do you think about the way we're talking about disability and the language we should be using? Mary?
I was just wondering if Kate might want to answer that first, but I'm happy to go first if you like.
Yep, whoever.
Yeah, I'll answer it. I think language is really important when you talk about disability because it reflects the attitudes that you have around the topic. Often, I think if people use euphemisms around disability, it reflects an understanding of disability to be other, and it reinforces that idea that it's something shameful that we shouldn't talk about. For me, there's a lot of discussion in disability advocacy around the use of person first or identity first language, and that changes depending on who you're talking to, what their experience of disability is. For me personally, I use identity first language. So that's the idea that my disability is not separate from me, it's an integral part of my identity. So I would describe myself as an autistic person and not a person with autism, because my autistic identity, the fact that I have autism encompasses every single part of my life. It colours every interaction that I have, any internal processes that I have, but that's not universal for everyone. So there is, it depends on who you talk to about the language that you should use. So there's also there's people first language. So you would say, oh, a person who is a wheelchair user, and that separates the wheelchair user from the person. I think that's important for others, not for me personally, but for other disabled people, and having that separation, that you can see them as a person that's not defined by their disability. But for me, I think I prefer it when people don't use euphemisms like things like special needs or autism specifically. When people say things like, oh, you're on the spectrum, I think that kind of reflects an idea that we're not comfortable talking about autism, so we're going to use softened language in order to make it an appropriate topic to talk about. So using the terms like autistic or using the terms disabled person is not offensive for me. I'd much rather people say it outright. And it's disability, saying someone's disabled is not a bad thing. It shouldn't have that all of that meaning, all of that. It shouldn't have that shame associated with it to just use the term that best describes us.
Thanks, Kate. Anyone else on the panel want to respond? Yeah, Mary?
Look, I just wanted to say that earlier, and we might want to repost it in the chat, we did put a language guide that People with Disability Australia have developed, which really goes into the intricacy of language and the importance of language. So that's a really terrific resource for anyone who would like more information. But I guess if you're not just sure, ask the young person how they'd like to be referred to. And, you know, that gives the young person the choice of how they would like to refer to themselves as well. And we have lots of these sorts of discussions in our organisation as well, so that we're really led by children. And I just wanted to touch again on another point that Kay mentioned around parents not telling their child that they have a disability. That's a really tough one because as Kay said, sometimes it can be very empowering for a young person to actually know that they have a disability, particularly for hidden disabilities. And I know certainly from my son, his identity is completely wrapped in his autistic identity. And for his mates, he went to a mainstream school. It was empowering for them too. And there were stories that came out of his 21st that would make your hair curl. But the overarching theme that come out is how much they appreciated his identity as well, and how proud they were to be Luke's friends. So I think language is important, but you can't uncouple it sometimes from disability pride, and I think it's really important. So Sally, I'll hand over to you.
I just wanted to touch on something that is a bit of a segue, I suppose, from the language about disability. Although a lot of my work is with people with intellectual disability, and I'm guided by their preference. So I guess this goes with the other comment about asking people what they prefer. But in some of our work, we sometimes get the comment from people that, especially younger children, wouldn't know. They don't know what's happened to them. And I would really like to take the opportunity to say that's not true. People know what happens to them. They know about their experience. They might not have words to articulate that, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to find a way to talk with them about what's happened to them and how they might have very big feelings about that. And I think that's really, really important, that sometimes as adults we want to protect children from things that have happened to them, but not talking about it doesn't make it unhappen. And so it's really important that we don't think that children with disability don't have the feelings about what's happened to them. They might not be able to tell you, but we need to find ways to help them understand and reconcile things that have happened to them.
And I guess from my perspective, spending lots of time with kids, it's about all sorts of issues. It's about what's happening at home. It's about parental conflict. It's about financial issues. Whatever it is, it's the thing that when kids talk about their lives, these are the things they're talking about, whether they've been talked with them and explained or not. So then how much of our approaches need to involve speaking to all children about disability? So moving on to, you know, when children aren't included or not invited to things or not experiencing the same as other children, is this about a requirement on us to kind of educate all children about disability? Mary.
I'm happy to give that one a stem. We did an extensive evidence review of the benefits of inclusive education and the benefits. And what the benefits of including students with disability in education is it benefits the non-disabled children as well. There's often this perception that we need special things for special children, but what is best for children based on the evidence is full inclusion, but it's also very good. If you've never had a friend with disability or you've never known a person with disability, then how are you going to be an employer of a person with disability later in life? So it really does need to start from early childhood education right through to education, and we need a real paradigm shift because there is so much overwhelming evidence for inclusion being benefiting everyone, and it really needs to be the root of changing community attitudes. Many parents of non-disabled children think inclusion takes resources away from their children, but they don't. It actually benefits their children, and educational outcomes are better for everyone with full inclusion. So that was the main point that I wanted to make.
Thanks, Mary. Anyone else got something to add on that? I mean, I think one of the things is, you're right. I think you said in your space, Mary, that the numbers of children who are being excluded from school, who are being suspended, who are doing part-time hours, are very modified in their access to education. And certainly in my work, this is what we found, that most of the kids that we spoke to had an underlying disability. So what's some of these paradigm shifts that we need to make within that education space, do you think? Any, Mary, Sally? I mean, these are big questions. I'm not, you know, if you've got the answer and it's a single answer, that'd be fantastic, but it's not, obviously. But comments?
Look, I will answer that just to follow on and then hand over. I think the really important thing is high expectations. And often children with disability are plagued by low expectations. And we need to really invest in high expectations. And what that means is teachers also understand how to differentiate curriculum so that everyone's learning the same curriculum, but it's just differentiated. And we've got a long way to go in supporting curriculum differentiation, but that social inclusion piece, and we did some research during COVID, and the kids with disability who did best were those where the schools made a really paid attention to not only the curriculum, but also the social inclusion elements. And it touches on what Sally said around friends, and friends being a really protective thing for children and young people. So, and I'm assuming a lot of people in the audience might be a mix, but how are services, in thinking there might be NDIS providers, how are you working towards supporting families to support the inclusion of their child? Yeah, so I'll stop there and let Kay and Sally have a chat.
Sally?
Kay, did you want to say anything before I leap in?
I just wanted to say that it's also, I think, the assumption that children will be diagnosed before they start school. And so by putting more inclusive processes in into your school environment from the start can help like disabled children who don't have that diagnosis before they start.
Great, thanks.
I think that's a great point, and it dovetails really neatly with what I wanted to say. It's good to see, we're doing some work at the moment with the South Australian Department of Education and about taking a child-centred view of how to prevent bullying for students with autism or autistic students. It's good that they're building on their whole school approach to wellbeing and engagement for students, and so looking at how autistic students as experts can build on their whole school approaches, rather than taking a specialist approach about how these students as separate and special can have particular strategies brought in place for them. It's how they as experts can contribute to whole school strategies. And I think that's quite an interesting paradigm shift, because it's how the whole school community needs to better support some of its citizen members. And I think there's something really nice about that.
And people might think this is stage any of these questions because I keep on saying, oh, in my work, but they're not, they're just coming out. So I would refer to the work I did on bullying in schools, because I think one of the things is for all children, they've all got strategies about what needs to happen in terms of preventing bullying. Clearly friendships are at the core of this, but what do adults need to do in order to put in place the environments where friendships can grow and develop and flourish? What kind of interest-based things can we bring together for children? Because particularly for the children with disability that I spoke with, it was when they were connected about things that they shared a passion with others of differing abilities that made them feel the happiest and the safest in their school environment. So someone might want to have a look at my bullying report, which talks about that. I'm going to shift just a little bit to the media. So there's been some questions about how important, given our worlds are so influenced by mainstream social media, the rest of it, what we see. Just wondering, what would we like to see in terms of the portrayal of disability in media? I might go to you, Kay. Is that all right?
Yeah, sure. I know for me personally, I try and filter out whenever they talk about NDIS on my news app, because lots of the ways that they talk about NDIS and the big blowout from NDIS kind of puts the blame on disabled people for being disabled and having to cost the government money. So I think the way that we portray, I know for autism specifically, there's only really two portrayals in the media. There's either like an autistic super genius or someone who's really struggling, and there's not that middle ground, and most of those representations aren't real. They're not real representations because they don't come from your own voice, like it doesn't come from disabled people talking. So I think, yeah, there's a lot more that we can be doing when we portray disability in the media, because often I think you just get those two extremes that either disabled people are very inconvenient or disabled people are very inspirational. And yeah, that's really horrible, because we have rich lives, we have different interests, we have different abilities, and none of that really gets portrayed. So you develop kind of, yeah, one of those two views of disabled people.
Sally? Yeah. Thanks, Kay.
I think what Kay says really highlights beautifully the absence of people with disability from ordinary community life in the way that media represents stories about all kinds of things. And then what happens is that people, Stella Young, the wonderful activist, coined the phrase inspiration porn. So people with disability are represented as these incredible achievers or as tragedy figures. And so when people are at one extreme or the other and they're absent in the middle, then it's hard to see people as people who've got the same human rights and citizenship expectations as everybody else. And while people are missing from the middle, then it contributes to this othering of people. And so we need to make sure that people are well represented in the middle, so that when things do happen at the other ends of the extreme, then we can represent people more fairly in the extreme, so that we can celebrate people's achievements and take appropriate action at the tragedies and the dreadful disparities that happen for people.
Thanks. Mary?
Oh, I was going to mention Stella Young too, and she's got a great TED talk, which is I'm Not Your Inspiration, thank you very much. And it's really well worth a read. And I guess one of the challenges with the media is how do we ensure young people have a voice in the media? And with our youth council, we've done media training for our young people. How do we get more voices of young people with disability into the media? And I guess this is another call to action to our 500 odd people. I'm sure for those who are in organisations, many of you will have, media you might generate as well. And how do you not play into these narratives around either deficit or inspiration for just doing things that are normal? We shouldn't be doing media stories about things that are normal for young children and young people. What we should be doing media stories is about the young leaders that we have and what their views are, not just about disability, but around about everything in their lives. And how do we make sure we give young people a platform? And obviously I'd like to do a shout out to Naz Campanella, who is ex-Triple-J and is now the ABC media reporter, and the wonderful work she's done in centring people with disabilities' voices in everything that's happening in the ABC as well. So, and there's been some terrific attitude changing stories and television shows as well that actually are really trying to tackle these issues.
Thanks. I think that kind of binary, inspirational or tragic, or the same with the portrayal of young people more generally as being either risky or vulnerable and not contributors or creators. I'm just wondering, part of that is also then how do we that intersectionality kind of conversation about how do we better hear from diverse voices and experiences, and who's missing from what we're currently doing? How do we ensure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children's voices, called voices, gender diverse voices are actually included in this as well? So I'm not sure if anyone who wants to tackle that one. Kay, or am I putting on the spot? Mary, put her hand up.
I'm happy to have a go while Kay's thinking, some thinking time. Look, it has to start with inclusion and accessibility. If you're not making your activities, events accessible for all voices, then you can't expect to hear from all voices. So that includes making sure that if you're doing engagements with young people with disability, you have easy read, you have really thoughtful processes around inclusion, and that you develop really inclusionary practice to make sure, but also look at partnerships with organisations who do work with young people with disability, to make sure that if you're from a youth organisation, how are you including young people in general youth work? or vice versa, if you've got a different type of activity that you're running, how do you make sure that you get the full inclusion of all voices in the work?
Kay?
I think, sorry, I think it kind of starts at like a top-down approach as well. It's not helpful. I don't think it's as helpful to just target those communities without making organisational change and thinking about who is organising these consultations, who's organising these engagements, whose voices are we listening to. So it's not that, I think especially with like cold communities, it's not you putting your own cultural understandings of a particular group onto that group for consultation, but having leaders in your own organisation from those minority groups and creating that opportunity for young disabled, cold First Nations, multiply disabled people to hold positions and to hold space to then make more space for other young disabled people. So I think that sometimes those communities can be targeted in a way that's like, oh, we're just ticking a box, but we're not making any change on how we're doing things. So I think creating opportunity for young people to hold space, but also to hold it in like a meaningful way that they can actually create change.
Sally?
I don't know that I really have a lot useful to add. I'm just thinking about the concept of cultural safety from Aboriginal cultures and how, I don't want to appropriate that obviously, but how we might learn from that for our disability communities in what it means to do, as Kay said, to hold safe spaces, and that it actually means more than creating an accessible event. It means being actively anti-ableist in our practice and creating cultures that help people to be actively welcomed. And that takes some time and some relationship building.
So I often hear when I speak with service providers that no one's against the idea of including people in their service design and delivery. No one says that's a bad idea. What people say is, well, our funding doesn't allow for this, or we now have individualised funding, which means it needs to be attached to an individual, so the capacity to run groups or to support people to attend, or all of those very practical kind of everyday barriers that people put up is the thing that I think gets in the way. And certainly, you know, when you develop some of those partnerships, you can push through that, but you know that things aren't being sustained. So I'm just wondering, what are some of the really, I guess, practical things that service providers in particular can do to actually embed this into the way that they do their business? Mary, you probably have more contact. I don't know. You might want to, you don't want to upset people, but I do see that there's lots of high principle documents that everyone's referring to that say that lots of there's opportunities for voice is there, and you know, I struggle to find it often.
Yeah, and look, I think the wonderful opportunity organisations have is to employ people with disability. And if we're talking around culture and inclusion, employing people with disability is one of the best ways you can actually become more inclusive as an organisation. And the challenge is you often put in employment, the emotional labour for accessibility often comes to the person with disability. And so that really needs a whole like Kay was talking about, a whole school approach. You actually need a whole organisational approach to inclusion that starts from not putting the emotional labour for accessibility on your disabled employees, but also thinking about what policies, do you have a workplace adjustments policy, do you have good budgeting around, we have a line item in our budget which we call inclusive participation, and that's so we can pay, you know, we have it costed, so we know that we need Auslan, we need captioning, we need easy read. How are you structuring your business for inclusion and actually having that as front and central? We've recently have an inclusion support officer that we're employing as well. We've got a dedicated resource that's actually going to be around making sure everything we do is inclusive. And inclusion is everyone's business, but you do actually need to fund inclusion properly. And, you know, you might hear, oh, well, you know, individualised packages, we can't afford that. However, if you're going to do this work well with human rights, you actually have to invest in this work and do it authentically. And the spin-off is, when you do it well, if you're running a business, more will come. So it's word of mouth. It's actually a very good business proposition to do inclusion well, and we're going to lead to much better outcomes for both our employees and, you know, the disability sector is one of the fastest growing industries in Australia. What an opportunity to be employing more young people with disability in our work, and giving young people career paths and opportunities as well.
Great, thank you. Does anyone want to add to that, or?
Just on a very, very practical level, I think for organisations that might be intimidated by how to include people in things like youth clubs or sports associations, there are lots of light touch education opportunities about how to access NDIS funding and supports. So, you know, how to support people who are on the NDIS to come into your activities. So there are organisations like the Growing Space and Disability Services Consulting, which provide really good, easy to access resources to help you understand how you can support people who have NDIS funding to use your community activities. So people who have packages should be part of wider community activities. And that's what the NDIS is for. It's not to support people in disability services. It's to help people use the resources that are available in wider community activities. So just finding out a little bit about how you can have those conversations with people that will help them just to sort of come into your community organisations would be a fantastic thing to do.
Great, thanks for both of those really practical suggestions. Is there anything about, we've had some stuff around, how do you capture the voices of the under 12s of children without adult kind of, without that parental lens on everything? Has anyone got any?
I wonder if you're best to answer that one, Helen, given your really fantastic work in working with young children. I think you've got some wonderful insights that we could all learn from.
Look, I think as you say though, it's about a deliberate investment in it. I don't think, unless we deliberately plan for and kind of pull this together, it won't happen by chance. And I think we've got much better at running sessions now where we have the parents and children, and I take the children off into a room. Parents know they're in the same building. It's not too frightening for the parents. We have a worker sit with parents and do the same process, really. The consultation that we do with children, we do with the parents as well. And that, I think, is now what we've done in terms of children with disability, but also children now with chronic illness. So any of the areas where, you know, where children can't independently attend, they do need their parents. So how do we engage parents in the process at the same time, I think is probably the tip I would give to anyone. We're going to start running out of time. I want to ask a specific question to Kay. And Kay, I'm just wondering, what do you wish adults had known, and maybe what you wish adults had done or not done through your life?
Okay, so I think there's a couple of things that I wish that my teachers at school did when I was at school, and that's use the term disability and recognize that there are differences between students, and to use terminology that is appropriate, that doesn't really, because I was separated into, for a year of school, I was separated into like a separate classroom for children who had just moved here from overseas and didn't speak any English, despite me speaking fluent English, because my school didn't have a disability specific classroom. So I think that by not having that support there and not terming it and not saying, oh, well, we see that you need extra support because you have a disability. For me, I was like, oh, am I doing something wrong? Am I a bad person? Am I just not keeping up with everyone else? And I think if someone had actually sat and said, oh, you have a disability and that does impact your ability to do certain things, and not kind of toed around it, I would have been able to come into my disability pride a lot earlier, than in my 20s. And two other things that I think would be helpful, is not offering generic advice to disabled people. Often when I talk about things like employment and how difficult it is to be employed as a disabled person, I'll get the same generic advice as like, just be yourself or just keep a positive attitude. But that doesn't overcome the barriers that I'm seeing. So like, making sure that you're acknowledging that there are barriers and that those barriers can't just be overcome by positive thinking or being yourself or like putting yourself out there, and just you having adults around me, looking at those barriers and how they can better support me to overcome or remove those barriers, and also to avoid pigeonholing disabled people. For me as a disabled person, I feel like often I am pigeonholed to only talk about disability, only talk about autism when I have so much more to do. I know that I wanted to look at autistic specific employment for a part there, but the only employment that you can get as an autistic person in Western Australia is data processing, because that's something that autistic people are inherently very good at. It's not something I'm at all interested in. You can see the butterflies there. I'm a biologist. So that making sure that you can see that disabled people aren't just defined by their disability and that they have a whole hopes and dreams and things that they would like to do that are completely separate from advantages that their disability might give them.
Thank you. We probably need to capture that on a t-shirt somehow, because I think those 3 points were the slam dunkers for me. They were exactly what I hear from young people across all areas. So thanks, Kay. We will distill what you've said. Sally, I'm going to come to you with the last literally, minute. What does good public policy need to look like in this area? Sorry, science question in like 30 seconds. So what do you think it needs to have in it?
It needs to reflect the priorities of young people and children. We've really had a signal failure to listen to children and young people's priorities, and it would be incredibly refreshing. I think Mary mentioned earlier that we've got a lack of disability in policy and a lack of children and young people in disability policy. So if we could pick up both of those things, I think we'd be well on the way to improvement. And it's a really important time to be thinking about that, because we've got the new National Disability Strategy coming down the tubes. We've got the new National Framework for Protecting Women. We've got the new National Framework for Protecting Children. So as we're putting together all of these big frameworks, it's the perfect time to be centering children and young people's voices.
Thank you. And Mary, because this webinar does cut out on the time it says it will, so what is it that you wish everyone else knew that you know?
Oh gosh, that is a really tough question.
From your brain.
Just that I think that centering young people's voices, children and young people's voices, will only benefit the work we do. It will only lead to the type of transformational change that we want. And if every organisation was doing that, how far we would come as a country. And so I think the final message and I said that a bit, is we all have a role to play here. And also, that we strengthen that notion of inclusion being absolutely the number one priority in the community, and we just need to focus on community attitudes, and the only way you can change community attitudes is through full inclusion, and it needs to cut across all systems, all services, and all policies really. And I think that, you know, in 10 years' time, I hope we look back and say, well, we don't put girls, you know, when we look at gender stereotypes where girls used to learn home economics and boys used to do a trade, that, you know, ableism, like sexism, is a really well-known term in our community. We don't tolerate sexism in our community anymore, and we need to get to a place where we don't tolerate ableism.
Great. Thank you for that. I think we're right. So the intersection of ableism and adultism is a dangerous place, and let's hope that as we move forward as a community, those things get lost. I have got literally about 10 seconds to say thank you so much. I found it a really stimulating discussion. Hopefully all the people online have as well. The recording of this will be available. I suggest that people share it, because I think there's been, when you re-look at it, there's some gold in there that needs to be mined and pulled out, I think. And that NAPCAN still have webinars running, I think, for the rest of the week, so it's not too late to sign up for more. And they've said, please go to their website if you need any more information on anything that's happening. It's been fantastic. Lovely to meet you. Kay, Sally, all good, and I need to leave because whilst they've told me it's not going to cut out, I've got another appointment to get to within 5 minutes. So thank you all. It's been fabulous. See you again. Bye.